the subtitle suggests, I will talk about finance and development today, and I will focus on finance and development and how financial markets and development policy have become entangled after the financial crisis of 2007 and 2008. And after having clarified this context of finance and development, I will talk a bit more about what do I actually mean with this term or concept of decent finance. And then after that, as the last step, we'll go to decent work. And since it's very early in the morning, I came up with two strategies to wake you up a bit. The first one is, I have a very strong and provocative hypothesis. Actually, the title, decent work or decent finance, is not really a title. It's not really a question. It's more a hypothesis which I have, and that hypothesis is very pessimistic. It says, decent work is dead, long live decent finance. Right? The second strategy, and that's maybe more important to wake you up, is we're going to start by watching a video.
Okay, work with me here. Ending extreme poverty worldwide will take some $4 trillion a year. Development aid is only $330 million. Another $1 trillion comes from remittances, philanthropy, and some other sources. So we're short. About $3 trillion a year short. Seems like a really big problem. Developing countries are a $12 trillion market opportunity. Opportunities in everything, actually. Hey, challenge. Just found your opportunity. So besides investors, who would it help? These people, to live a healthy life. This man in getting a good income. Or give this woman a chance to create something incredible. And everyone else in developing and developed countries alike. It's not just about getting private sector money into development. It's a process about when to use it, when to use public money, insurance, guarantees, or some combination that best fits. Not to replace development aid, but complement it. The World Bank Group and other development banks have the expertise to help private finance tap into developing markets, not just to invest in infrastructure projects, but in people. We call it maximizing finance for development. A little wonky, we know. And while developing countries are doing their part, it's just not going to be enough. That's why we need to rethink financing development, so this little one has a healthy life. And this woman can disrupt an industry with her product idea. And this youth, her big idea can change the world. In the end, we get strong markets and strong communities. And all of us get a world of opportunities. To learn more, check us out online.
Alright, by now everyone should be awake. So it's a World Bank video which is quite recent, and it presents the new strategy of the World Bank of maximizing finance for development. Now, why did we watch this video? I mean, the obvious reason is I like watching videos. All the students who come to my classes know that. But there's also a more academic reason, of course, to it. And that is, I believe that such kind of videos are similar to policy reports or newspaper articles or other documents which we use as data. They really tell us a lot about the narratives, the stories, the people, the strategies behind development. And why is that important, especially for development? Because development as a concept is, like Wolfgang Sachs, who also teaches here in Kassel, says, a concept of monumental emptiness. It's not really defined. It lives because it is so vague and it's easily filled with contradictory and even conflicting perspectives. And one of the ways of how development has been redefined in recent decades in the neoliberal era is by defining a particular nexus between development, growth, and poverty. And it doesn't really come as a surprise that the World Bank strategy in the neoliberal era, or at least since the early 2000s, has been making markets work for the poor. Right? So a very market-based strategy. Now the argument I want to put forth today is that this making market work for poor from the early 2000s has shifted after the financial crisis to an emergence of a discourse that we can call decent finance, of making financial markets work for the poor, or, as the video has showed, maximizing finance for development. Now this agenda is huge, and as the video is talking about, you can look at different areas: agriculture, transport, infrastructure. All of these things become assets and they become linked to financial markets. But one of the dimensions I want to talk about today is the role of people, the role of households, the role of financial inclusion, which I think is one of the most important pillars of this imaginary of decent finance. And this financial inclusion development project will hopefully tell us more about how this finance and development project has shifted in recent years. Now let's start by a brief historical context. Who has heard of microcredit or microfinance as a development policy? Just hands up. Okay, so almost everyone in the room. Microfinance, microcredit is a super important intervention. It actually started in the 1970s and 80s with a lot of different experiments in diverse countries such as Indonesia and Kenya and Bangladesh. And all of these experiments happened at a time when these countries were involved in a debt crisis. They were exposed to the structural adjustment programs of the World Bank and the IMF. And microcredit experiments were kind of a way of a bottom-up strategy to cope with the emerging inequalities and poverty in these contexts. Now, by the 1990s, there was something which we could call the Washington Consensus on Poverty. And in the 1990s, actually, and that's the reason why all of you know about it, microfinance developed into a panacea for development. It was mainstreamed by literally all of the relevant development organizations, I mean, of course, the World Bank, but also all kinds of development finance institutions, human rights organizations, very positive media reports. The Consultative Group to Assist the Poor is a very important think tank that was founded in the mid-1990s, and it pushed this agenda of microfinance. Now, microfinance was attractive not only to the international development community, but to a lot of different people involved in development, because it had a very clear narrative to offer. We give poor people money, and with that money they can work their way out of poverty. So we empower them, we have poor entrepreneurs, and better so, we have women empowerment, because essentially microcredit was designed as a development intervention targeting women. So we are linked and connect this to the whole role of gender mainstreaming that happens also in the 1990s in the world of development. And of course it's also decentralized, so it's not really burdening the coffers of the fiscal or the budget of states, but it's a decentralized bottom-up approach. Now, by the mid-2000s, microfinance had its peak. And we can see that peak maybe with the Muhammad Yunus, who's a famous economics professor from Bangladesh, who won the Nobel Peace Prize together with the Grameen Bank that he founded for his invention of microcredit lending. But towards the end of the 2000s, microfinance came into a legitimacy crisis because more and more stories came up that it actually didn't really work so much, that the poor didn't really work themselves out of poverty, that many people were over-indebted. And so more and more critical studies, also in development economics came up that criticized microfinance and said we don't really see robust results of this. And then the financial crisis kicked in, the North Atlantic financial crisis, with major eruptions. And it further increased the crisis of microfinance because a lot of the capital that was invested through development finance institutions was not, they were taken out of this microfinance. And so essentially, microfinance had to reinvent itself. And that reinvention happened through the new development agenda of financial inclusion or inclusive finance. Now, very briefly, the difference between this new approach and the old approach can be something like, the one is referred to as poverty lending and the other as the financial systems approach. And that is because microfinance initially was a non-profit NGOs which were heavily supported by development financial institutions, so public funding, in order to ensure some kind of entrepreneurial growth. But the new development agenda is all about profit-driven corporations. So these non-profit NGOs have morphed into huge companies that are tightly entangled with financial markets and get transnational capital, which is then lended on to households. Now let's look a bit more in detail about how is this birth of decent finance possible. And I've selected 2 quotes from 2 important people, and I think these quotes tell us a bit about the concept of why decent finance was necessary. The first quote is from the former central bank governor of India, and he was interviewed on why financial inclusion was actually implemented in India and why he thinks, well, what is the policy rationality? And he said, the global financial crisis warranted a massive coordinated policy intervention both by governments and central bankers to save the world economy from depression. The financial sector was viewed as villain by many, and governments and central banks were often accused of failing banks out at a great expense of the exchequer. In the context of the GFC and Occupy Wall Street, policymakers must have felt a need to demonstrate that they were concerned as much with ordinary people as with finance. Right? So we can see this politicization that happens around the financial crisis of Occupy Wall Street, other movements, but also the media reporting about the massive inequalities and how they are linked to financial capital, but also the excesses on financial markets. And within this politicization, there was a need amongst policymakers to show that finance was also concerned with people, that it's not simply extractive, it's not only fostering inequality. The second quote is from Robert Shiller, who won the Nobel Memorial Prize, and he's one of the most influential development economists. And he wrote a book after the financial crisis for his finance students, which is called Finance in the Good Society. And in that book, I mean, the introduction is full of references to Occupy Wall Street and how there's a politicization of finance and how more and more students in his classes at Yale University are also questioning what are we doing with these, on financial markets? Is that not unjust? And he tries to come up with a new justice theory of why finance is important for a good society. And very interestingly, he talks also about Marx, I mean, not very often, but a bit, and his reading of Marx is also very sketchy, but one of his quotes is that Marx never explained clearly why it is that laborers do not have access to capital. He implies that under capitalism, the goals of society are set by those at the top, those with access to capital, and not by all the people. It is true that social barriers prevent some from realizing and profiting from their talents. An illiterate farm boy from a remote area finds it difficult to walk into the offices of a bank of a big city to ask for capital to start a business. And so the solution actually to this problem is not kind of redistribution or other types of work or ownership, but rather democratizing capital, democratizing access to capital, humanizing and expanding the scope of financial capitalism. And this is the context in which this new international development agenda was born. Now, I talked about before that I think development is very much, it's an empty concept in a sense, but it's very much defined by the way that development, growth, and poverty, this nexus, is linked to one another. And so in this age of financial capitalism after the financial crisis, growth, of course, was finance-led, right? So we live in the era of finance-led growth because financial markets, hedge funds, and all of these big financial players are central to the type of growth or the accumulation regime that is happening. And so this finance-led growth had to come up with some kind of legitimacy for ordinary people. So it was linked to poverty by way of social inclusion. And if you mix finance-led growth with social inclusion, you come up with inclusive finance or financial inclusion. And that's the whole remodeling of this development paradigm. The important thing is that if we look at all the policy reports of financial inclusion, they mention that it's not about redistribution. Redistribution is even portrayed as something dangerous. There are World Bank reports from 2008 and 9 where they said, oh, many development economists are now questioning our market-based approach, and they're saying we need more redistribution. But inclusive finance is so clever because it offers opportunities to people instead of redistribution. And so we have something vaguely which is called inclusive growth that is very much found also in all the policy reports. And the democratization that Robert Schiller mentioned is not a democratization like Occupy Wall Street or other movements would have wanted, right? The democratization of how the economy works or how decisions are made. But democratization just means the expansion of financial products for poor households. And now, the new development subject that had to be invented for this agenda were the unbanked or the underbanked. And some of you may know the story of how development was created as an ideology by Harry Truman, or a very, very famous speech at the end of the 1940s, and by essentially coming up with this idea of underdevelopment, right? So development was created by underdevelopment. And very similar, I mean, I'm not reading this up because we don't have time, but it's a very interesting article from Arturo Escobar on development. And very similar to this creation of underdevelopment and development, we can see this creation of a subject of the unbanked or underbanked. So suddenly we're not talking only about the poor, but we talk about the unbanked. And of course, the only solution that underbanked that we can give to them is giving them bank accounts, giving them full-fledged financial services. Now, this is not only an elitist academic policy idea that I'm presenting, but it's very much at the heart of the development project. And to show that, I have copied a picture of the Sustainable Development Goals, which all of you know probably. And we can see that decent work is part of one of the development goals. Inclusive finance or financial inclusion is not any of the explicit goals, but much better. It's part of 7 or 8 of these categories. And if we look in the criteria, we can find that inclusive finance, access to finance, microfinance, so different wordings of the same thing are mentioned in the goals for no poverty, zero hunger, good health and well-being, gender equality, decent work, industry, reducing inequalities, etc. So for a large share of these sustainable development goals, it's important. If we look at the first target of no poverty, right, which is still an idea from the Millennium Development Goals, it's very interesting that we can find access to financial services and microfinance explicitly mentioned, but decent work is nowhere to be found. Jobs, working conditions are not mentioned when it comes to poverty, but access to finance is explicitly mentioned. So this is just to show you that this idea really is at the heart of the development project, and it even gets royal support. So Queen Maxima from the Netherlands, who is a royal, is the UN Special Advocate for Inclusive Finance for Development, and I've looked on her website what she writes about inclusive finance, and I think it's a very interesting statement that you can find, which says almost a third of the world's adults struggle to get by without the financial tools they need to escape poverty and improve their lives. And that statement implicitly says that these people need financial tools in order to overcome poverty. They don't give a rationality for why this is necessary, but it's completely assumed in most of these development documents that access to financial services is absolutely crucial in order to overcome poverty. Now, let me talk, okay, I just have 10 minutes left, right? Okay, let me talk a bit about how is it possible that this agenda was actually implemented, because it didn't just fall from heaven, but obviously there were actors and interests and people who told stories and who lobbied for these things to come true. So one of the institutions I already mentioned is the Consultative Group to Assist the Poor, which is a World Bank in-house organization, and it was created in 1995, and it was really one of the most important institutions to push microfinance and to come up with training modules for the World Bank and for all of these evaluation reports around microfinance. And like most development organizations, it's very much funded from the development and foreign ministries of most OECD countries, right? So we can find the European Commission in there, we can find Canada, US, and all of these other, South Korea. So most of the OECD countries, plus some development financial institutions like the KfW or the African Development Bank. And similar to the CGAP, there's now for the agenda of financial inclusion something like the Better Than Cash Alliance. Right? The Better Than Cash Alliance was invented after the crisis to say basically we have to move away from cash to only digital financial services. And the interesting thing is that all of these institutions which push for microfinance or inclusive finance are not only funded and owned by these former colonizers or by the OECD countries, but they are essentially financed and staffed also with expertise by huge philanthropic foundations like Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, MasterCard Foundation, but also Credit Suisse. So actors in this financial field who have a material interest also because they are investing in these things. Now, because of time reason, I cannot go into detail, but actually, if we look at other institutions like the Alliance for Financial Institutions, it's very similar that we can find the convergence of interest between philanthropy capital, transnational finance capital, and governments of the global north who are actually pushing for this agenda. But now I want to talk a bit more about what are the material interests behind it. Why is this so important? It's important because I've talked about the unbanked, right? And more than 50% of the global unbanked live in just 6 or 7 countries. And these are the 6 and 7 countries. The interesting thing about these countries is that credit-debt relations are quite vibrant. So if you look at Indonesia, for example, then the incidence of indebtedness, so the way that people are involved in credit-debt relations, is as high as in the European Union. But in all of these countries, the formal lending is quite small, whereas most of the credit comes from informal or non-formal sources. That's family and friends, informal money lenders, that can be saving clubs, or all kinds of informal institutions that people are engaged with. And that means there is a huge market share in these countries, especially because there are massive countries like China and India with a population of more than 1 billion. So a huge consumer market which can be entered because these people are already indebted. And now this becomes interesting for international capital. This is a graph from someone of the finance industry, so he's a hedge fund manager, and he wrote for the International Banker, which is kind of a blog in the international capital scene, and he came up with this graph where he says the market opportunities in developing and emerging economies, if we bank all these people and if we really manage to link them to financial products, are as high as 380 billion. Okay, so it's a massive market. Of course, that market is not only the poor and the unbanked I've talked about. So if you look at the biggest region of Asia Pacific, in 2014 there was a lending volume of about 26 billion, and that is supposed to increase threefold to 79 billion US dollars. And most of the money can be made from the emerging middle classes here, obviously. And the emerging middle class is then for housing or car loans or whatever. But a substantial section comes from people who earn less than 1K a year. So that's something between 2 and 3 US dollars a day. These people are the poor and the unbanked. Okay, so I have only 5 minutes left, so I'm moving to the part of decent work now. How can we link that to decent work? If you look at what the World Bank says about decent work, they are really pessimistic. Because unlike in Europe and North America, where most of the adult population is actually engaged in formal wage and salaried employment, in other regions like South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, most people work in the informal economy, right? So they are own account or self-employed workers in agriculture, they are daily wage laborers, or other forms of really precarious wage labor that is not really formalized and is not part of that, the formal economy. Now, this, says the World Bank, indecent work is also the reason why they are financially vulnerable. Okay? So the high financial vulnerability of these households is a result of their indecent work. Now, if that's the case, and the World Bank says that, right? So many people in South Asia work for themselves or their family, they are more likely to lack social safety nets and they face greater risks from economic shocks than salaried workers. Now, if their indecent work is the reason for their financial vulnerability, one can say we need to improve the working standards, we need to come up with decent work. But instead, the development discourse is we need to give these people access to finance and not decent work. And that access to finance will manage economic shocks. That access to finance will give them access to social safety nets. So how does that work in action? And now we're talking about financing livelihoods. This is a graph from the World Bank's Microfinance Handbook. And the chart is very nice because it shows that the World Bank estimates there are about 1.6 billion working age adults which are considered as the working poor. So they live below or with less than $2 a day. And most of them are also the unbanked. Now the interesting thing is the story about inclusive finance is not anymore about entrepreneurial credit, because just a small share of about 10% are micro-entrepreneurs of these working poor, right? The majority are, as I said, precarious wage laborers, right? Daily wage laborers, seasonal migrants, casual laborers, or even unemployed, but then unemployment is really a difficult category because mostly these people are not unemployed, they do some forms of activities, but that is not really recognized. And another substantial section are small and marginal farmers. Now, how is that linked to this whole social safety net thing? Even the World Bank's new Microfinance Handbook, which is kind of a draft for all the microfinance practitioners, says these working poor people, these precarious wage laborers, they need financial services in cases of catastrophic health event protection in order to smooth their consumption, because their incomes are very irregular, but their expenditure remains the same, right? So in a way, finance becomes an invitation, or finance becomes a way to manage the indecent working standards of the people. Decent work, again, is nowhere mentioned in this. Now, if we link this back to the video that I showed in the beginning, then in the video it was said developing countries are a $12 trillion market opportunity. And that market opportunity covers everything: transportation, infrastructure, healthcare, welfare, etc. Now, in order to become that opportunity, of course, the public has to fund healthcare and these things, but they have to also be turned into assets, right? If healthcare is turned into an asset, then usually it's privatized. If it's privatized, people have to pay for accessing healthcare. And if people cannot pay for healthcare temporarily through credit, and that would be the link to this. Okay, so let me sum up the depth of decent work. If we look at the Sustainable Development Goal 8, which mentions decent work, then we can see that it actually embodies a contradiction. And I said this in the beginning, that development is often filled with contradictory and conflicting meanings. And in the Sustainable Development Goal 8, we can see a conflict between a market-centered approach of the International Organization of Employers and a rather human rights-based approach of the International Trade Union Confederation, right? And we can see that because Sustainable Development Goal 8 is not only about decent work for all, but it's about sustained, inclusive, and sustainable economic growth. And a part of that inclusive growth, and this is what I've argued, is all about inclusive financial markets. It's not inclusive in the sense of redistributing growth for the benefits of that, but including more people into that segment which is growing, and that is financial services. And this is then also bizarrely called democratizing finance. It doesn't have anything to do with democratization, but democratizing in the sense of spreading financial services. Now, full and productive employment is an illusion without plan, I would say. I mean, I didn't support the statistics so much because there was not much time. But if we look at the working reality of the majority of the working class in the world, the idea of full and productive employment is fictitious. And it's something, I mean, I think Alex Gallas said this once nice, it's a methodological Fordism, right? So the thinking that in the mid-20th century there was a particular stable period of capitalism where in some regions of the world, in the capitalist core economies, full and productive employment were possible. But we don't see any plans in most of these countries that I showed, Indonesia, China, India, how this full and productive employment is going to happen. And finally, I think we don't see decent work for all, but instead, decent work is dead, and long live decent